So we're now recording. So welcome to the first of my presentations on counseling methods, an integrative perspective. It's my perspective. So starting off with, I want to look at the background. How did I get to the particular place I am? Because once you understand that, I think the issues come together in terms of the theory and my approach with a fair bit of clarity. Now, not everything that's relevant is here, but I want to give you an overview of kind of the conceptual background to get us started. And I need to find a down link. There we go. So this journey begins back in the 1970s with my undergraduate studies at the University of Manitoba. Not that it was deliberately setting out to study therapy and therapeutic methods, but I was receiving the ideas that became for me completely formative of everything since. The three that stand out right away are critical sociology, looking at, heavily from a Marxist perspective, issues of how culture shapes human beings due to economics. That is, we live in systems, and the way economic structures function have an incredible impact on how people live, the way we think, what we do. So that was absolutely formative. And then another core piece was the course I took in ecological anthropology, which again looks at how human beings are located in systems, this time in ecosystems, and looking at how calorie counting, that is, examining where calories come from and how they're distributed, is a powerful tool for understanding human behavior. And I've continued to read in this field with some of the core people, Marvin Harris, Roy Rappaport, Sarah Hardy, over the years since. This has been an absolutely profound part of how I think. That is, how people earn their living, get their food, turns out to be critical to really how the culture functions, how it thinks, what it perceives as a value, how it evaluates human life and meaning. So very important pieces come out of just these basics of human life, our from basically our food. And then I took every social psychology course I could get my hands on. I just was fascinated by this interaction of people and their environment, looking at the skews and biases that human beings have, where they come from, how they reside in the brain, what triggers them, and then what are the outcomes. This was absolutely fascinating for me, kept me deeply engaged. I learned so much from these courses, so much that framed everything since. And then in particular, I fell in with this guy, Dr. David Martin, the psychology instructor at the University of Manitoba, who taught psychology, but with a very distinct perspective. His job, from his point of view, was not to teach psychology, but to help his students become better people. And he did it very much from within a Rogerian behaviorist way of thinking. And this was very much his work. He was very clear about it. He's actually a student of Carl Rogers at Chicago, and but found himself at a loss to try and explain how Rogers' therapy worked. All he could do was testify that it worked. But that for him wasn't good enough as an academic. He was called upon to justify why he thought it worked and couldn't, and ended up moving to behaviorism as a way of trying to explain what Rogerian therapy did. And so he taught from this perspective of trying to help us become better people through learning the tools of active listening and then explaining how that functioned as a tool for changing human performance. So what to summarize everything in one line, he talked about how active listening functioned as systematic desensitization. Systematic desensitization being the behaviorist term, active listening being Rogers' methods. And what he said is, when we listen to people, we allow them to recast their experiences so that they actually become different experiences. We change the way they feel. We give them a different emotional hue. And for him, this is very much looking at how brains function. And so he very much turned me in the direction of neuropsychology. Mind you, at that point, we're talking the late 70s, was very, very primitive compared to where we are now. But his point was that there's something about the way the brain functions that is being caught here. And we're working with in terms of how we work with each other to become better people. Then later on, I studied at Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminaries in Indiana and studied in the context of Rogerian family perspectives. This was the perspective that the psychotherapy profs had adopted. There were three of them. I studied with two of them, David Augsburger and Marcus Smucker. That they'd adopted to try and help people work to become effective counselors. I was in the counseling training program initially. I dropped out, um, did not like what I experienced personally, and perhaps anyway, I didn't like what it did to me. That would be the accurate statement. But I learned so much from these two men in terms of how active listening takes place in contexts. For David Augsburger, he looked very much in terms of family roles. So this would be an early form of family therapy, and also very much stressed the issue of cross-cultural differences in counseling. That is, culture has an impact on how people respond even to basic things like active listening. It means something quite different depending on the culture you're in. So that was a very important part for me, something that really stuck. And then Marcus Smucker was very much looking at his background. It was Amish. He actually grew up Amish. And so he had a strong sense of how the social context and history of the people changes the way they function. So very closely attuned to looking at these sociocultural historical factors in the way they change people's response to therapy. He was quite convinced that the Amish responded differently to therapy than other folk based on the way they lived, how they lived, what it meant to them. So very much this sense of people in systems. And then he was also very much interested in integrating spirituality into the spectrum of therapy. I haven't done a lot with that, but it was a very intriguing component of what he was teaching. Uh, Someday, perhaps I'll do more with that. Then, many years later, so now we're up to about 2016. So after a good 25 years of gap doing other things, I came back to psychotherapy through Bowen Family Systems Theory at Living Systems out of Vancouver. So I entered their training program to start learning more about how families functioned. I'd actually done a lot of work with family life in my doctoral work, but from a very demographic point of view, looking at families as units of life engagement, life event experience, but realizing by the time I was finished my dissertation that I did not understand what I was looking at. I was missing pieces. I needed to understand more about families and how families functioned. I had a hard time finding people who could teach me. The closest I got was the Bowen training program that Living System was offering. This was the only extensive program that I could find that really looked at families seriously at the level I needed to understand them. So primary instructor there was Randy Frost, and we watched lots of videos with Mike Kerr, exploring the way Murray Bowen outlined his family systems perspective, the various concepts. Come back to that next Sunday. And then I have to say, I was really influenced by Dan Papero, who was not a direct trainer in the system, but we worked with him. He's another Bowen uh, therapy worker, another therapist who works with Bowen theory. But he had a slightly different take on Bowen's perspective, where he was looking at families as adaptive networks. That is, for Murray Bowen, there's more of a sense of pathology about the family, I would say, than Dan Paperos, where it's more of simply it's an adaptive function. And you need to work at more effective adaptive processes. So I thought that was a very distinct shift. And I've really hung on to that one too, as I've moved forward. However, so so Living Systems got me connected up with clients and started me with counseling through their program. Got into it. So this is 2018. And it didn't take long for me to recognize that I was struggling. I was facing problems, that I was trying to do therapeutic work from a Bowen family perspective, but I did not know what I was doing. Like, what are the methods? Asking good questions framed from the theory clearly was a very helpful tool, but it didn't answer the questions. What am I doing with the clients? It didn't help me to really know what I was. What do I do next? Well, they've got this problem. Is there a perspective that would help me? So asking good questions certainly was really helpful. Clients did a lot of work. There's a tremendous verification there for much of Bowen theory, but it wasn't effective. So what I ended up doing was kind of rooting around, trying to find approaches and thinking back to what David Martin taught and realizing that what he was doing was really on the edge of what we've now called cognitive behavioral approaches to therapy, that are very much looking at the way we can change our behavior by better thinking. And it seemed to me that this was a logical next step. So I can apply cognitive behavioral approaches in the context of Bowen family systems as a tool that helps clients clarify the personal change issues, how to work at things. I could use the tools from cognitive behavioral therapy to integrate into a Bowen framework and allow clients then to do more effective work. So I did that, and that came quite easily and made a lot of sense. A comment on the side here is that Bowen theory tries to identify that other theoretical perspectives contaminate Bowen theory. I don't think so, and that I think will become very clear as we proceed. I think it's a question of they're each looking at different sides of the problem or the position or the person, and each offers a tool to work with it. It's not about being eclectic, it's about the proper integration of things that actually do integrate. And we'll see where I go with that before we're done today. And then I came across in my research internal family systems, a wildly different kind of way of looking at things. And I'll come to that again next week. But what I found with internal family systems, it just gave me a handle to deal with what I was experiencing with clients who'd come through significant trauma, which was quite a lot of mine. About half my clients at that point had come through childhood sexual abuse, intensely traumatizing, and they behaved in ways that suggested there were things going on quite aside from anything that either Bowen family systems would allow me to deal with or a cognitive behavioral approach would allow me to work with. Coming across internal family systems struck me as one of the missing pieces. It really helped me put people together in terms of what I was seeing and how to work with them. And so all three of these I came to see them as an integrated whole. That is, when you talk to the theorists, they don't agree. They would say that these are not compatible. But I would actually say in practice, they work together very solidly. The question becomes then, is there a meta theory that would integrate them? And maybe there is, and maybe I'll come up with it. But the current theoretical perspectives are limited. However, there are still missing pieces that even with the three, didn't take me long to recognize I am still not dealing with some of the stuff that is real. And that brings me to part two, the 9-question framework. So what I want to do for the next bit is Having come through these experiences that forced me to think and rethink what I was experiencing, trying to work with clients effectively, I ended up developing what I call the 9-question framework. I'm still working on it. It's still in its initial stages, but for me, it has become the framework for integrating everything that I know about human beings into a context, a framework that I think works. And so that's what I want to do next is look at this 9 questions framework, where it comes from, what it tries to do, and that will wrap up this section. And then next week, look at the theory and perspectives and how they kind of come together and perhaps with some integration at the end. But for now, I want to run through the 9 questions. That'll wrap up this section of the presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions. So onward to the 9 questions. The 9 questions emerge from a starting place, which is that humans are problematic, and not in the sense that we are a problem that we exist, but that we are problematic organisms. We are problem oriented. We struggle, we function, we live to solve problems. That's who we are. That is what it means to be human in some very important ways. That if we start looking at the way our brains are designed, they're designed around assessing, evaluating, and decision making. That is, they're designed not to live or to be, but to solve problems, to make life easier, to resolve issues. But it's even worse than that. When you start really getting into the way the brain functions, you realize that we need problems in order to thrive. The brain is very much a use it or lose it organism, which means that if you're not using it to do what it's supposed to do, which is solve problems, it literally starts to disintegrate, starts to deteriorate. But the good news is a life typically causes problems. There are very few people who don't have any problems. And those who don't have problems, I worry about them. Uh, they are a problem. Anyway, but so human life is inherently problematic. Life causes problems, but that isn't what drives people to therapy. That is typically it's serious problems are what drive people to therapy. But we have to start off the starting position is that humans are problematic. That is, our existence is problem filled. And then we hit a certain point where we need to talk to somebody in a therapeutic framework. Okay. Now I want to note here. So if we're starting with problematic, people are problematic, then I have 3 questions that I think get at begin the structure of how we think then about human beings. That is, so people experience pretty intense problems, drives them to therapy. Where do you go from there? How do you problematically express the issues, the potentials, the needs out of that? And so there are 3, I think, problematic starting places. Where am I? How did I get here? Where do I go next? Those are the 3. That is, and these are neutral questions that frame things simply in terms of present, past, and future. And they also frame the self as both outcome and agent. That is very much an issue of personal narrative. So for dealing with therapy, there are many questions we could ask about human beings, the meaning of life, where they're going. That's not the point. Well, not my point anyway. I want to ask these 3 questions that are about the narrative of a life, past, present, and future. Where am I? Where am I now? How did I get here? Okay. And then where do I go next? Because as clients move through those 3 questions or question starting places, because there's more, that is, it gives them that sense of past, present, and future and allows them, I think, to more effectively then understand who they are and make real progress in terms of their future. Then, a side note here, these questions are not about self-actualization. which turns out to be the normal framework for almost every therapeutic perspective I've run across, including that is, I really want to make sure that we're looking at things in terms of a more dynamic perspective. That is, the questions are the reality, not the self. We're not trying to achieve self-actualization. And the core reasons why is the self is not, in fact, a coherent concept. If you dig into the psychology of self, uh, there is really no self. However, it is a good working tool. It is a kind of heuristic, a way of putting the evidence together in a way that's useful. So I don't want to discard the concept of self, but I really want to put it in a brackets and make sure I'm not trying to actualize the self of clients. They don't, I keep holding in my head, they have no self to actualize. Okay. And then going with that is there's no authenticity. And this is an important philosophical issue, but is also present with a lot of therapeutic methods. That is, there is no authentic core to actualize. That is, if you don't have a self, then there can't be an authentic self. Because the reality is existence is transient at all levels. So we have to think about things in terms of the questions, but it's a dynamic, I'll repeat that probably many times, it's a dynamic context. So that ultimately what we need to do is review life in terms of the questions we face, these contingent questions of the moment, not try to achieve a final resolution. There is no final resolution. And I could go on at great length about the philosophical ideals behind self-actualization and why they're not that sound. But for me, I really want to stress that we're looking at the dynamic question nature of our existence. And then, so we've got the three fundamental question sources, and then we've got three poles of life: myself, others, and world. These are classic. The Greeks articulated these as the three poles of life, thinking about who I am, who others are, and the way the world is. So these three then are the intertwined components of existence itself. And if we're thoughtfully look at them, each one embodies an essential component of our life world. Okay. Now, you can question these three, and people have done so. And one of my core questions is, what about the transcendent? Is there a fourth pole to life? And I've really thought hard about that and not been able to come to anything strong that would allow me to say I should integrate it into this, even though I am convinced of the reality of the transcendent. How to integrate that into this kind of perspective, I don't know how to do that yet. Maybe at some point I will. I certainly don't know. But so we've got three questions. Where am I? How did I get here? Where do I go next? And then three poles of life: myself, others, and world. And together they create the 9 questions of life. Where am I in relation to myself? How did I get here? In relationship to myself. Where do I go next? In relationship to myself. And so on, in relationship to others and the world. That is, these 9 questions are the questions that I have come to recognize as the orienting point for how I work with clients. That is, if we start thinking about them carefully, these 9 questions allow us to work with clients in ways that get at the whole of their lives usefully, and then from which I can then apply therapeutic theories, methodologies in a way that to me makes a lot of sense, allows me to do work that I think is effective with clients, at least I believe it is. My clients seem to stick with me, so we'll use that as a kind of verification. And anyway, I continue to develop them. And so where I'm going to go next is look at these a little bit more, and then I want to end this section by looking at questions of theory in relationship to this. So as I do so, I just note that therapy then is a recursive journey through the 9 questions. You don't answer them one at a time, That is, you're cycling through them as is appropriate for the client, as is appropriate for the moment. So to then give a little bit more depth to these, what do they mean? So to give a little bit of a sense, where am I in relationship to myself? This is, I would say, one of the more common starting places for clients. They feel lost, confused, ambiguous, or even disgusted with self. And regardless, it's a good question because all of us need more clarity regarding who we are. What are we doing? What are our roles? What's our identity? And what does our life mean to ourselves? And that last one I find I keep coming back to more and more with clients. What does our life mean to ourselves? What do they mean to themselves? How do you find motivation if you don't know who you're trying to become? What sense of your place is in this world for yourself? I increasingly see it as a vital question in therapy. Then, where am I in relationship to others? Again, this is another one of those core questions that drives people into therapy. It's a deep problem for many. They experience conflict with others. They feel lonely and lost, or sometimes intense anger. Mind you, intense anger doesn't tend to bring them to therapy, but it gets revealed in the context of therapy that they are intensely angry about how they've been treated and where they are in the world. Um, so this again becomes a really important question. And it begins to explore something which I think is critical, which is we look at that, all of us need others in order to function effectively. That is a profound truth that I don't think gets enough attention in most of the therapeutic methods and theory that I've seen. That is, we can't function on our own. Dan Papero, I think, really pointed that out quite effectively in his work. That is, how we function is limited or enabled by the people around us. And that would be obviously true looking at the larger theoretical issues around how human beings perform or even brain psychology. We need other people. Um, but that, I think, turns out to be a very important therapeutic question as well. So that if we're trying to figure out where we are, we need clarity about our relationships. We need to understand how we function in relationship to the people in our world if we're going to get a sense of where we're at, what we're dealing with, what we're trying to accomplish in therapy, where we're trying to go in therapy. And the last of these major three I'm starting with here is, where am I in relationship with the world? I find clients show up with this as a significant question as well. That is, they're experiencing frustration or anger in relationship to their careers and social success, and they have some sense that it has to do with who they are. It's not merely they're not educated enough, they don't have the right position in the world, they don't have the right connections, but there's something about themselves that is interfering, that is blocking their ability to function successfully in a career. And turns out that regardless, how we function in the world is central to the resources available to us. That is, for all of us, it doesn't matter who we are. How our ability to work with others and function in the world is what gives us almost all of the resources we have to work with. It turns out it's also a really important part of our identity. We name ourselves often by our careers, by our jobs. Uh, so that is another significant component. And then this I find really interesting is when I start working with clients on career-related issues, it often turns out that it is revealing of their personal issues and potentials. That is, this brings them back into themselves in some important ways. So turns out to be a very, it's not in the literature, it's not where we stand, and yet I come to see it as a really important component. So then if we look at the next question, how did I get here? This is a core developmental question critical to understanding the why of life. So, how have I treated myself when I'm thinking about myself? What decisions have I made? This is an important part of the journey. Or looking at others. How was I raised? How have others treated me? How have others supported me? Again, a very important component of how we got here. Or what is it about the world that shapes me? Class, race, gender, or demographics, economic culture, the history. the place that we are. Now, this last one, again, is often neglected in therapy, and we'll see that in some of the theories work. But again, it's a very powerful aspect of how we became who we are and what shapes us and needs to be taken into account. We want to know who we are, well, how we got here, where we were born, color of our skin, culture we were raised in, all of those turn out to be quite significant. And then also the last question, where do I go next in relation? This is the question of the future. There is, I would say, not enough emphasis, but there's certainly some emphasis on the future, particularly cognitive behavioral approaches are very future oriented. But regardless, we've got three questions here. Where do I go next in relationship to myself, others, and world? These are all important questions. Life has trajectories. We need to make thoughtful decisions. Therapy is a great place to work at things, come up with the solutions to problems or the adaptive strategies to the conditions of our lives. So these are important. Then to look at them in their larger sense, I think these are integrated questions. They're not distinct. That is, each question takes part of its meaning from the others. They're 9 linked questions because life is lived as what I think of as interactive wholes. That is, the parts of our existence, the answers to these 9 questions are interactive. So we can think of it this way: selves drive relationships, others enable selves, and the world provides resources for selves and others. That is, the fundamentals of each of these three connect with each other. And then when you're exploring them in therapy, as each question is explored, it always reveals dimensions of the others. You hit points where you can't help but you've got to move into another one of these interactive components. And it's a recursive process, which is in a certain sense a little bit frustrating. Because once you enter therapy, you realize after a while you'll never get out. The asking and therefore the answering is never finished. Well, and part of it, and then in therapy itself, you'll find that the answers that you come up with to these 9 deepen the questions themselves. And you keep going back to the question because as you've answered part of it, you realize there's more still to be answered. And that also that over your lifespan, as you keep going, your experiences transform the questions. Different things stand out. You can see things. Other evidence comes to mind that wasn't there before. So the 9 questions, you keep coming back to them. They don't end. They're not final. They're about the process of life itself. You can keep going back and answering and answering and answering. And every time you do, the question reemerges, but in a slightly transformed way. These are life questions, not merely questions to answer. And last here, before I stop, and then I'll turn it into a discussion session, and we feel free to ask whatever questions you want. I want to quite briefly look at then how I put theory in relationship to that. So this is where I'll start off with next time. So if you look at these 9, and you can see that I have located the different theoretical perspectives across them in different ways. That is, the different theoretical perspectives respond to different components of the question. And this is how I have come to start integrating them. That is, these 9 questions, different theories help us understand how human beings exist in relationship to these 9 questions. Where we go, where they came from, and where we are right now, all emerge from them. But it isn't just psychotherapy then, it's also social theory. And you'll note in the bottom right-hand corner, I put career planning. I don't have any good career planning theories, but people do career planning, and that is really that last box there. So each theoretical perspective explains different parts, explores different parts, and therefore helps us answer different parts, which means as I next week look at the theories themselves, begin to see we have to look at how they help us function. So which of the things I draw out of the theories, how do I try and apply them? What's my rationale for that? That's next week's. So I am going to wrap up here and stop recording.